Alien invaders arrived in the mysterious dream realm, their ship cutting through the night sky, illuminating it with a blinding light. Having descended on a flying vessel, the interstellar knights immediately began landing, preparing to conquer this mysterious world. As soon as they set foot on the ground, they took out high-tech firearms and confidently moved forward, as if the battle was already decided. But suddenly a dull thud was heard, causing everyone to freeze. When a mysterious shadow appeared in front of them, their faces distorted in surprise. Just a few seconds later, gigantic titans emerged from the darkness, screaming wildly in praise of their mother as they began to crush the knights with their massive legs. With fury and power, the giants brought down their giant clubs on their enemies, striking them with crushing force. Some warriors managed to hide behind massive boulders. One of them, breathing heavily, asked if reinforcements had arrived. The answer was not long in coming. A moment later, another knight reported that the artillery detachment was already there. The commander-in-chief did not hesitate for a second and gave the order to immediately begin unloading the heavy weapons. Then, with firm confidence in his voice, he ordered the giant cannon to be loaded. The warriors immediately obeyed and opened fire, releasing a barrage of energy charges at the colossi. One of the shells hit the titan directly in the body, sending a powerful electric discharge through it. The giant shuddered, fell to the ground, and fell silent in its death throes. Space Knights shouted triumphantly, declaring victory, and then ordered the artillery forces to begin a full-scale offensive. From that moment on, the battle raged with renewed vigor. The space warriors began methodically destroying the remaining titans. Meanwhile, the commander of the artillery detachment, standing on the top of the mountain, loudly announced that they were about to reach the promised land. Obeying the order, the knights moved to attack, cutting a path to the goal through chaos and destruction. Suddenly, there was a screeching sound of metal bolts, and the massive doors of the majestic, glowing castle swung open with a crash. A beautiful girl with silver hair emerged from the shadows. She walked forward confidently, showing no fear of the invading invaders. The commander-in-chief, without a moment's hesitation, raised his space weapon and aimed it straight at the ruler of the promised land, attacking without the slightest regret. A moment later, his cosmic blade pierced the ruler. The girl froze for a moment, then leaned towards the commander's ear and whispered that she forgave them all. Exhaling and spitting out drops of scarlet liquid, she stretched out her arms, hugged the commander-in-chief of the artillery corps, and closed her eyes with a quiet sigh. At that moment, space shook from a powerful explosion that sounded like a thunderclap tearing apart the sky itself. The Dream Realm planet instantly disappeared into a furious flame, leaving behind only a blinding light that cut through the darkness. High above the spectacle, in Imperial Junction N35, a young girl with silver hair watched as a massive explosion engulfed the once majestic planet. Without taking her eyes off the cosmic abyss, she said in a cold voice that the cracked nebula had finally broken apart. The girl loudly declared that this would lead to even more destructive consequences. Noticing that the balance had been upset once again, the silver-haired girl turned to Raven 12,345 and declared that a decision needed to be made immediately. At that moment, an exact copy of the first girl appeared before them, revealing herself to be Raven 112345. Grinning, she gestured to the side and said that the first silver-haired girl, Raven 233, should take this into consideration. Raven 112345 then confirmed that Raven 230033's words were true. After a few moments, Raven 12345 began to dissolve into space, leaving behind only the words that she would return very soon. Continuing to watch the Dream Kingdom planet slowly crumble into chaos of explosions, Raven 233333 spoke about how, although she already knew part of the history of the Dream Kingdom, about the years of development of the ruler, but as a goddess, according to Raven 233333, the ruler should be proud of herself. As she said this, Raven 2333 slowly clenched her fist, as if confirming her intention. After a while, Raven 12345 approached the Snow-White building, and without hesitation, entered inside. Walking down a hallway decorated with many paintings, Raven 12345 headed towards a massive blue crystal, and then realized that this was exactly what she was looking for. Walking around the crystal, Raven 12345 noted that after the report was compiled, they would send this object. Suddenly, Raven 112345 turned to the blue crystal and asked it defiantly if it was the most beautiful in the galaxy, to which the crystal responded without hesitation that it was certainly not. Seeing Raven 233,333 behind her, Raven 12,345 smirked and said that she was disgraced by this artifact. In response, Raven 23,033 frowned and asked why Raven 12,345 was joking so lightly when Raven 233,333 was actually feeling stressed. Raven 12,345 laughed shyly and asked Raven 23,333 to wait a bit to give her a chance to try again. As Raven 12,345 approached the crystal, she frowned and demanded to know who would be giving the girl the award at the end of the year. To this, the blue crystal coldly replied that there was no result. Raven 233,333 remained motionless, staring straight ahead. Raven 12,345 frowned and pressed her lips together, not taking her eyes off the crystal. Suddenly, Raven 12,345 kicked the blue crystal hard and shouted loudly, demanding an explanation on how to resolve the crisis in the dream realm. However, at that very moment, the massive crystal began to fall. A few moments later, it shattered into countless pieces with a crash. Raven 12,345 froze in a daze. Raven 12,345 picked up one of the pieces of the shattered crystal and looked closely at its smooth surface. Realizing that it was the mother crystal, she widened her eyes and exclaimed again about her reward at the end of the year. Looking at the reflection on the shard, Raven 12,345 saw in it a haggard young man with dark hair. A girl with blonde hair and pointy ears playfully tossed a brick in her hand, watching what was happening. Then she gripped the brick tightly in her palm and swung it forward. The girl stared at the young man with a sly grin. The girl with ears stretched out her hand and pointed her finger at the winged girl soaring in the sky. The young man froze in place, feeling the intense gaze of this strange girl. He exhaled heavily and rubbed his eyes, trying to figure out why he suddenly felt like he had fallen asleep too early, and whether it was just a hallucination. The girl with the ears squeezed a brick in her hand, thinking to herself that this mysterious tenant was to blame for everything. A few moments later, a girl with blue hair appeared in front of the young man. She smiled pleasantly and called him the landlord, after which she asked if he wanted to go there on the 1st of the month. At the same time, the girl clearly noticed that he had some doubts. The young man raised his hand and pointed at her, saying that he was obliged to accompany her. Suddenly, the blue-haired girl came up close and
I would be very happy if you subscribed to the channel, liked and wrote a comment, rating this manga on a scale from 1 to 10. Your opinion is very important to me. This will help me better understand what my audience is interested in, because you are really important to me.
Started sniffing him. The young man blushed and felt awkward, and the girl suddenly declared that she was familiar with this smell. Hearing this, he turned pale with horror, instinctively retreating back, and asked why she had come so close to him. Trying to hide his embarrassment, he cleared his throat, put on a calm expression, and reminded her that, as he had said, he always remained straightforward. The young man also noted that if someone decides that he is behaving inappropriately, it will lead to trouble for him. Turning around, he calmly walked on, however. Feeling someone's piercing gaze, he tried to calm himself, convincing himself that it was just a strong girl. Suddenly, she called out to him, unexpectedly calling him master. The young man turned around sharply, perplexed. The blue-haired girl with a warm smile stated that he was a good man, much better than anyone she had met before. She admitted that this was why she wanted him to stay. Then she apologized regretfully for dragging him into this whole situation, since this creature was clearly hunting her. The young man and the blue-haired girl looked away. Suddenly, the fair-haired girl with ears rushed towards him, grabbed him with her arms and pushed him to the floor. While the girl with the ears looked at him in confusion, he raised his eyebrows in surprise and began to examine her carefully. Noticing the tail and ears, the young man became even more confused. Turning his gaze to the girl named Lele, he immediately asked in a stern tone what the hell was going on. Leela pressed her lips together for a moment, but then rose from the floor and apologized again. Then she explained that she was a werewolf. Suddenly, her gaze slid to the side. At that moment, Lele noticed the winged girl rushing straight towards the young man, who froze in surprise. His brows furrowed, and his face grew pale with fear as she approached. At the last moment, when she was about to run into him, he suddenly arched his back and threw his head back. The girl with wings flew past. At that very moment, the young man felt a sharp pain in his back. His gaze fell on a broken pipe, from which water gushed in a powerful stream. Suddenly, Leela called out to him, calling him master again, and asked worriedly if he was all right. Frowning, she insistently told him to hurry up and run, because the winged girl would soon return. Hearing these words, the young man looked thoughtfully at Leela, and thought with surprise about the girl who looked like a she-wolf. He could not understand at all why Leela was here. However, inside himself, he realized that from this day on, his life would become a rich series of adventures. He also realized that all this would only matter if he stayed alive. Suddenly, the winged girl began to turn around and go back. Leela gripped the brick tightly in her hand and rushed forward. The girl with wings confidently landed on the ground, then suddenly flapped her wings, creating a powerful gust of wind that threw Leela to the side. Leela stopped abruptly and then kicked the ground so hard that the asphalt beneath her cracked. Without wasting any time, she rushed at the girl with wings again, aiming a blow at her wing. However, she flapped her wings, pushing Leela back again. They froze, standing opposite each other. Their eyes met, flashing like two discharged lightning bolts. Leela glared at her opponent, then clenched her fist so hard that the brick in her hand instantly shattered into tiny pieces. After that, she turned sharply, headed away. But, on the way, she grabbed another brick from the pile of stones, frowned, and again stared at the girl with wings. Meanwhile, the winged girl soared into the air and began to look around, demonstrating obvious irritation, while not hiding her sarcastic grin. Then, using the power of the wind, she deftly waved her arms, slightly shortening her skirt. Leela inhaled loudly, and then let out a powerful roar, releasing waves of blinding golden energy. She confidently rushed forward, then pushed off the ground with force and took off. In just a few moments, she was right next to the startled winged girl, glaring at her with a vicious, furious gaze. The winged girl frowned in response, staring at Leela. Without wasting a second, Leela made a sharp dash forward and swung her fist, aiming at her opponent. However, when the blow was about to hit its target, the girl with wings suddenly disappeared. Leela landed on the ground, immediately looking back. At that moment, the winged girl appeared in the air again, right behind her. Leela turned sharply and threw a brick. The projectile hit the winged girl right in the forehead, shattering into pieces. She screamed from the impact and lost her balance, falling rapidly downwards. The young man, noticing this, turned around in horror and watched as the winged girl fell to the ground. However, after only a few seconds, she took off again, flapping her wings. The young man continued to watch her, rubbing the bruised area. Leela, seeing her opponent casually tossing the brick in her hand, cried out in surprise, wondering if it really was just a brick. Pointing her finger at the winged girl, Leela smirked and made a mocking remark about her having the courage to continue flying. Continuing to demonstratively hold her hand in her direction, Leela drew her eyebrows together and broke into a sly smile, confidently declaring that wings would not help her opponent avoid a fight. The girl with wings hovered silently in the air, as if assessing the situation. Then, with a sharp smile, she soared upward and disappeared into the clouds. Leela and the young man watched her go in amazement. Leela turned her gaze to the young man who stood there with a tense and gloomy expression. But suddenly, he sneezed loudly. This surprised Leela so much that she even opened her mouth in shock and raised her eyebrows. Rubbing his nose with his hand, the young man said that sudden changes in temperature were too hard for an ordinary person. Seeing the worry on Leela's face, he sighed and said that it seemed like a cold was inevitable. Leela lowered her head and pursed her lips, as if she was thinking about something important. After gathering her courage, she hesitantly addressed the young man, calling him master. The young man raised his eyebrows in surprise, his eyes widening in anticipation of what Leela would say. Taking her yellow suitcase, Leela began to slowly change her appearance, while telling him that she would no longer be renting his house, so he had better return home as soon as possible. When her appearance completely changed, turning into a blue-haired girl, Leela gasped and asked the young man not to tell anyone about today's events, because it could bring her a lot of trouble. The young man was silent for a while, listening attentively to her words. Then he smiled slightly and sighed deeply. Still smiling, he asked her where she was going so late at night. Little Lai, hearing this, involuntarily returned to her werewolf form with a tail and ears, which made her face even more embarrassed. The young man, noticing her confusion, raised his eyebrows and invited her to come with him. He also added that he would unpack her suitcase, and then she could go to bed early. Surprised by this proposal, Leela began to question him about why he was doing this, and whether he was not afraid that the winged girl might return. She suggested that perhaps she was being persecuted precisely because she was a werewolf, and therefore the winged girl's sworn enemy. Leela spread her arms wide and said that ordinary people would have been scared long ago. Then she asked curiously if he had ever met someone like her before. Little Lai added that in many movies, people react with horror to such things, because a werewolf is a creature from nightmares. Then she turned back to the young man, asking if he really was not afraid. After finishing her long tirade, Lilai sighed heavily and muttered that it was time for her to stop talking. Suddenly, the young man asked her if she was scared herself. Lilai froze, looking at him in confusion. He came closer and stroked her head lightly. Still smiling, he noted that he did this because he considered himself a good person. Lilai smiled slightly in response, then looked at the young master with hope. The young man looked up to the sky and noted that it was late, so they had to go. He then added that he would cook food for her. Gasping for breath, he asked Lilai if she ate vegetables. She confidently replied that she ate absolutely everything. After some time, they finally reached the house. The young man immediately announced that this was his home and that Lilai would now live there. He also explained that his father had built the house and noted that the architecture was quite modern, but he hoped that Lilai would be able to figure it out. Walking inside, he smiled and pointed to the lounge, explaining that one of the rooms was his and the one on the left would be hers. Then, swallowing, he asked if she had brought her own bedding or if she would use what she already had, as girls usually did. Suddenly, Lilai interrupted him, saying that it was no problem, since she only needed a place to sleep. She added that she couldn't bring all the bedding anyway. But after she finished speaking, she suddenly froze and blushed deeply. Lilai grabbed the young man by the shoulders and insistently demanded that he immediately start cooking. She added that she would do the cleaning herself. When the young man went to the kitchen, Lilai looked out from the restroom and promised that she would put everything in order and would definitely thank him for the treat. Turning on the gas, he put a pot of water on the stove, wondering what Lilai might have brought with her in her suitcase. Perhaps it was a weapon or some kind of relic. He assumed it might be something special related to werewolves. However, the young man decided not to interfere in other people's affairs, thinking about shadows, bats, the smell of blood, and sudden changes in temperature. He began to wonder if he had encountered a vampire. At that moment, he took out a cigarette and lighter, but in his thoughts he lit the flame too hot. The fire flared up next to the stove, and he almost started a fire. In horror, he muttered something about heaven, realizing how stupid it was. Putting his cigarette and lighter aside, he stared thoughtfully at the blue flame of the gas stove. At that moment, a thought struck him. Maybe a werewolf was even better than a vampire if he turned out to be so clumsy. Meanwhile, Lilai sat in a chair, enjoying the wonderful aroma of the cooking food. After a few minutes, the young man announced that the noodles were ready. Placing a plate in front of her, he proudly announced that it was Hai Hao's family recipe. After tasting the first dish, Lilai sighed blissfully. At this time, the young man looked away and called out to someone named Gan, announcing that it was time for dinner. At that moment, someone ran up the stairs. Lilai shuddered and then froze, her expression frozen, noodles in her mouth. A moment later, the owner of the house grabbed the cat by the scruff of the neck, smiling as he noticed that it had been circling the table for a long time. Holding it carefully under its paws, he reminded it that the food might get cold. As soon as he put the cat down, Lilai jumped up and jumped onto the sofa with a scream. The young man froze in bewilderment, still holding the cat. At that moment, the girl flipped the sofa over in a panic. He glanced around at the chaos in the room and smiled nervously. At this moment, Lilai peeked out from behind the sofa and said in horror that it was a cat. Then, narrowing her eyes, she hissed angrily at little Gan. She was still breathing heavily after putting the sofa back. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really afraid of cats. Different. Lilai immediately changed her tone and loudly declared that she was not afraid. However, hiding behind the sofa, she returned to her human form. With her hands in the air and tears in her eyes, she admitted that cats simply frightened her. The young man hit himself on the forehead and asked if it wasn't the same thing. Then, holding Gan in his arms, he came closer and reminded her that she was a werewolf. Lilai transformed again, turned pale, and fearfully told them to stay away. Then she sharply flicked her tail in front of his face and insistently repeated that she was indeed a werewolf. Peeking out from behind the sofa, she asked if he was sure the cat was not a threat. The young man raised an eyebrow and pointed at Gan in confusion, asking what was wrong with him. Then, petting the cat, he noted that it was one of the most obedient pets he had ever met. Gan purred in response. Introducing Gan's cat to Lilai, he noted that it was now up to her how much food they would get. Then, with a grin, he asked Gan to be more polite to their new neighbor. At that moment, Lilai screamed loudly. When the owner tried to come closer with the cat in his arms, She jumped back sharply. He moved aside, but Lilai immediately darted to another corner and then jumped over the sofa. Peeking out from behind the shelter, she asked what the cat's name was. The young man repeated that his name was Gan, and her own name meant 3 dots on the water. After calming down a bit and finishing her noodles, Lilai turned to the young man and asked suspiciously if he was hoping that she would disappear from here as soon as possible. Hi-Ho's owner explained that the cat's name means disappear in English. He also said that Gan likes to jump on his bed while he watches TV, and he once accidentally called her by that name. Stroking the pet on the head, the young man added that over time the cat began to respond to this name. Realizing that she had gotten used to it, he asked her if he was calling her correctly. In response, Gan quietly purred. While the owner was telling this story, Liu Lilai calmly finished her noodles and exhaled blissfully. Returning to her human form, the girl smiled and noted that she felt as if she was in a completely unfamiliar place. Walking through the room, she asked curiously where the TV was. The young man thought that perhaps the werewolf found this house even stranger than she did. Suddenly, he felt a sharp cold and shuddered involuntarily. He began to tremble, and he wondered in bewilderment where this feeling came from. Liu Lilai suddenly reported that it was a ghost. At the same moment when the signal on the TV screen disappeared, the doorbell rang in the house. The owner shouted loudly that he was already on his way, but he noted to himself that the girl heard the sound even before it rang. Opening the door, he instinctively asked who had come so late. In front of him was the same girl with wings who was now standing hesitantly at the threshold. Seeing her, Liu Lilai's mouth opened in shock. The young man spread his arms wide and froze, looking at the uninvited guest in shock. The girl with wings also froze, pressing her palm to her chest. He carefully extended his hand and pointed at her. In response, the girl gasped and covered her mouth with her hand, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Suddenly, she pointed a sharp finger at the young man and loudly declared that she had seen him before. Then, with panic in her voice, she asked if he was dead. He frowned and asked her what she had just said. However, a moment later, the silhouette of this girl in the sky appeared in his memory. Then he wondered why the same vampire who was here earlier appeared again. He suddenly jumped back and loudly exclaimed that this was complete nonsense. Then he turned to Liu Lilai and shouted for her to transform immediately. Without wasting any time, the werewolf once again assumed her true form and rushed forward. At this moment, Hi-Ho's master shouted her name. However, the winged girl suddenly grabbed his sleeve and shouted at him to be careful. He turned to her and froze with wide eyes, shocked that the vampire was warning him of danger. At that very moment, Liu Lilai rushed at them both. The girl with wings abruptly threw the young man aside, stretched out her hand and blocked the werewolf's powerful blow. Their gazes met. The vampire's bright red eyes studied Liu Lilai intently. The werewolf, despite her trembling hand, continued to grin and did not stop attacking. Suddenly, she shouted loudly, demanding that the tenant be returned to her. The vampiress narrowed her eyes, then, frowning, turned to her and asked, "Since when did wild animals start appearing in cities?" After Liu Lilai repelled the attack again, the girl with wings asked venomously if catching rabbits was a favorite pastime of her kind. In response, the werewolf snorted and shouted that she couldn't even catch rabbits herself. The vampiress motioned to the young man, getting his attention. Then she spoke to him in her mind, advising him to flee immediately. She declared that she would detain the werewolf here, despite her injuries. The owner of Hyohan raised his eyebrows in surprise and opened his mouth in complete shock, not understanding what was happening. The vampire frowned and looked at the young man carefully. The werewolf Liu Lilai flashed her bright golden eyes, turned to her and called her stupid, adding that she might not understand, but suddenly, Liu Lilai grabbed a brick and, with a confident shout, swung it at the vampire, declaring that she had one last trump card. However, when the werewolf was about to strike, the vampire dexterously dodged. Seeing that the attack had not reached its target, Liu Lilai cursed angrily. When she entered the house with Tenente Hi-Ho, she immediately loudly demanded to know where exactly the vampire was hiding. The young man froze for a second. The next second, both he and the werewolf moved at lightning speed. At that moment, the vampire attacked, grabbing Liu Lilai by the face. With a powerful jerk, she knocked her to the ground, still squeezing her head. The asphalt beneath them began to crack. From the force of the blow, they flew in different directions. But before she lost her balance, Liu Lilai suddenly straightened up, threw her legs forward, and kicked the vampire in the stomach. The impact sent the werewolf flying backwards, crashing into a wall and a pile of cardboard boxes. The vampire stretched out her arms, creating a bright pink energy circle in front of her. Without wasting time, she began to attack, releasing energy arrows from him. The werewolf deftly dodged each attack, but finding herself in a dead end near the wall, she was again under threat of attack. The vampire frowned, raising her hand and releasing a new powerful stream. Bright pink energy. Liu Lilai instantly ducked down, then pushed off the ground with force, rushing towards her opponent. Grabbing the vampire by the shoulder, she triumphantly shouted that now she would not be able to escape. The vampire's eyes widened in surprise. The werewolf was already anticipating victory, insisting that it was checkmate. However, before she could deliver the decisive blow, the vampire disappeared. Liu Lilai froze in confusion, and then felt a strange presence behind her. The vampire appeared behind her again, creating another energy circle, and ironically asking what exactly she said about checkmate. The next moment, a powerful stream of black and pink energy hit the werewolf straight in the back. Liu Lilai screamed loudly in pain and fell to the ground. She stood up with difficulty and saw the vampire confidently approaching her. At this time, the owner of the house, Hai Hao, heard a noise outside and glanced to the side. Anxious voices could be heard from the neighbors. Some were asking what was going on, others were suggesting calling the police, and some were suggesting that a fight had broken out outside. He frowned and rubbed his temple with his fingers, irritated that these people who were in a panic were only making the situation worse. Scratching his head, he realized that he could not allow the werewolf and the vampire to continue their fight. Otherwise, the consequences could be catastrophic. He ran his fingers over his chin and thought about how if the two girls didn't stop, they would eventually be spotted. In that case, they could be captured and handed over to scientists who would literally take them apart for research. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Hai Hao snapped out of his thoughts, raised his head, and loudly declared that they must stop fighting immediately. The werewolf Liu Lila immediately turned to the young man and told the tenant Hai Hao to run away immediately, assuring that she would stop the vampire. At the same time, the vampire herself turned to the young man and repeated the werewolf's words, emphasizing that she would be the one to stop Liu Lila. After saying these words, the vampire, confident in her strength, stretched out her hand, formed an energy circle, and without hesitation, directed it straight at the stunned Liu Lila's face. But Master Hai Hao gasped, waved his hands, and hurriedly said that perhaps the girls had simply misunderstood each other. He then said that he wanted to clarify something first. Liu Lila rose into the air, and the vampire froze when the young man caught their attention. Approaching the vampire, he hesitantly addressed her, calling her Miss Vampire, and then, swallowing nervously, asked if she really wasn't going to kill him. The vampire raised her eyebrows in surprise, then pointed her thumb at herself and calmly stated that she was actually trying to save him. Liu Lila immediately protested loudly, asking who the vampire was trying to make her out to be. Frowning in displeasure, the werewolf shouted irritably that Miss Vampire wanted to drink the tenant's blood, and smirked, adding that she knew this from TV. She also confidently stated that no vampire could be good. The vampire tilted her head and mockingly asked who had kidnapped the young man first. She folded her arms and noted that Liu Lila had hidden him to hide her identity. The vampire then looked down at her and calmly stated that the werewolf could continue to hide in this human city, but such tricks had been used for centuries and nothing had changed. Hearing this, Liu Lila bristled with anger. The irritated vampire asked if the werewolf really wanted to fight. Seeing how the situation was getting heated, the owner of the house, Hai Hao, began to tremble nervously, attracting the attention of both girls. Suddenly, he couldn't stand it any longer and shouted loudly, demanding that they stop fighting immediately. After that, he invited them to his home to discuss everything calmly. After a while, they were sitting at the table drinking hot drinks. The cat named Gan was purring contentedly, lying on her back. Liu Lila had returned to her human form, but she and the vampire continued to glare at each other, creating a tense atmosphere. Hai Hao just watched silently. There was a tense silence between them for a long time. At some point, Hai Hao, unable to bear it any longer, hesitantly broke the silence, noting that it was already quite late. The vampire adjusted a strand of hair and politely asked the young man not to call her a vampire. She then explained that true vampires were servants of the blood, devoid of reason. The aristocrats, to which she belonged, were able to restrain their thirst for blood. With a sigh, the girl noted that people often misunderstood them. She then said that she could call herself Ai Yi Wei, but she could not yet reveal her full name. In a cold sweat, Hai Hao asked her name again, and then asked if it was true that she had no intention of attacking him and Liu Lil tonight. Ai Yi Wei, taking a cup of hot drink, calmly replied that she saw him with a werewolf and did not know whether he was deceived or forced. Indignant, Liu Lila suddenly grabbed Hai Hao by the neck and loudly declared that there was no way she could force or coerce him. At this moment, Ai Yi mentioned the curse of the werewolf's claws with a smile. Hearing this, Liu Lila's surprise made her grip on the young man's neck even tighter. Ai Yi then said in annoyance that Liu Lila thought she was ignorant, but she was well aware of such things. The werewolf immediately released Hai Hao and asked in amazement if Ai Yi was really that powerful. The vampire only snorted in annoyance, saying that it was not a compliment. Hai Hao turned to Ai Yi with a serious expression and insistently asked her to listen to him. He swore that Liu Lila had not cast any curse on him. Ai Yi grinned, baring her fangs, and placed her hand on his shoulder, assuring him that he had nothing to worry about. She stated that she knew that he was simply trying to hide the curse because he did not believe in her power. Ai Yi then sneered and promised to show off her power once she recovered. After that, she arrogantly called Liu Lil a wild dog who only knows how to throw bricks. The werewolf froze in shock, her eyes wide. Liu Lila jumped up, slammed her fist on the table with all her might, and loudly demanded to know who the vampire called a wild dog. She then called Ai Yi a rat, and when she noticed the crack in the table, she turned to Hai Hao, assuring him that she would pay for the damage. Ai Yi smirked and slapped the table back, causing it to crack even more, and challenged Liu Lila to ask if she really wanted to start the fight again. Hai Hao shuddered, looked at the crumbling table, and asked with a trembling voice what would happen to his furniture. Meanwhile, the cracks on the table continued to spread. Ai Weiwei approached Liu Lilai and began to claim that werewolves were always unable to control their strength and were always looking for trouble. In her opinion, this was the reason why their race was in such a sorry state. Liu Lilai bared her teeth in anger and screamed, demanding an explanation again. Suddenly, Hai Hao's master clenched his fist and violently broke the table in two. The loud crack scared the cat named Gan and, meowing pitifully, he ran away. Hai Hao shouted loudly that he had enough because this was his home. The young man then told the girls to look at themselves and realized that one was acting like a complete idiot and the other was being too stubborn. He then frowned, pointed his thumb at himself, and loudly declared that he was the only one involved in this situation. Remembering the hotel in Transylvania, full of all sorts of monsters, he thought about how werewolves and vampires in the past hunted people for food. Then the young man asked in confusion, since when did they start protecting people? Ai Yi and Liu Lilai exchanged hostile glances again and prepared to fight again. Ai Yi angrily declared that she was not some wild animal, clearly referring to Liu Lilai. At this point, Hai Hao could not stand it any longer and said abruptly that they should first sort things out before arguing. At this time, Gan was playing with a piece of paper carefree, purring loudly. Hai Hao sat down on the sofa, and Ai Yi, with her arms folded, calmly admitted that she did not know how things were with other creatures. Turning away, she added that she had always thought that she and the vampires existed in this world completely alone, not counting humans. With a sad voice, Ai Yi admitted that she hated even her own kind. She guessed that it was probably because most of them were just as stupid. Suddenly, Liu Lilai raised her voice and said that she woke up in an icy place, right in the middle of a snowy field. Rubbing her nose with her finger, she added that she woke up in human form and then was raised by her grandmother. Then Liu Lilai revealed that after several decades of living among humans, she had to leave when people around her began to suspect something. The reason was simple. She stopped growing up. When Liu Lilai asked if Ai Weiwei and Hai Hao had any more questions, the cat Gan came up to her and meowed. The werewolf immediately shuddered in fear. Ai Weiwei, with a calm expression, turned to Hai Hao and asked if he really didn't believe Liu Lilai's story. Hai Hao looked away tiredly and replied with a nervous voice that it didn't matter whether he believed it or not, the young man still wouldn't be able to defeat any of them. Hai Hao then told Ai Yi to forget about it for now and asked her why she came here in the first place. He also asked if she was here looking for Liu Lilai. Ai Yi looked at him in surprise and admitted that she was just looking for a place to live at the address. Showing him the brochure, she smiled happily and added that the rent here was too attractive. After confirming that the address was correct, Hai Hao asked in amazement if that was really what she came for. Hearing this, Liu Leilai calmly pointed her finger down and said that she had already prepared the rent money. Suddenly, Ai Yue screamed in surprise. In shock, she began to wail, asking where her wallet had gone and how she could have lost it. Liu Leila froze in surprise, and Hai Hao remained silent. Ai Weiwei loudly exclaimed that this was the 4th time in a month that she had lost money, and that it was her last savings. Hai Hao smiled nervously upon hearing this. Liu Leilai looked away, and then Ai Weiwei suddenly shouted that she remembered something. She pointed her finger at Liu Leilai and loudly accused her of stealing the purse, saying that it was definitely her doing, since it was because of her that she fainted. Hearing this, the werewolf shuddered. Liu Leila frowned and with obvious doubt advised Ai Weiwei not to shift the blame to others, since it was her own negligence. Then, looking at her, the werewolf suggested that perhaps the wallet had simply fallen out, and Ai Weiwei should look for it in the nearby streets. After hearing this, Ai Weiwei stood up silently and then finally apologized to Hai Hao for her sudden intrusion and left the house. At this moment, the young man wondered how it happened that things ended up like this. He also couldn't help but think about Ai Weiwei's family and what had happened to them. After coming to his senses, he waved his hand and told the vampire not to worry about it. Suddenly, Hai Hao's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. After a while, he was already riding on a bus that creaked on the turns. Looking out the window, he remembered how he had recently received a call from this number, and someone's voice had spoken to him. Hearing this, Hai Hao raised his eyebrows in surprise and began to listen intently. The voice on the other end of the line said that it was a foreign trading company calling, and explained that Hao Ren had sent them his resume 2 days ago. The girl explained that she had contacted him to schedule an interview for the afternoon. She then gave instructions. Hao Ren should take the bus at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and get off at the Turtle Heap stop, where the company's office is located. After that, the girl immediately ended the call. Hao Ren glanced at the screen and was surprised to see that the call had lasted exactly 0 seconds. At that moment, Liu Leilai approached him and asked him about the upcoming interview with a smile. Then she confidently stated that he should not worry, because she would stay at home and keep order. Smiling happily, Liu Leilai assured Hao Ren that she was doing a great job with the housework and that nothing would go to waste. At this time, Ai Weiwei thought about it, noting to herself that Liu Leilai was acting just like a dog. After a while, Hao Ren arrived at his destination and got off the bus. Seeing a stray dog chewing grass near an iron column, he made a face of disgust. Suddenly, he swore in irritation and shouted something about Turtle Heap in a loud voice, wondering if he was being played. Then, he began looking around for the mysterious trading company. The dog, hearing his cry, froze and even covered his muzzle with his paw, as if shocked by what he had heard. Hao Ren clutched his head with both hands and screamed in despair, not believing that he had actually been lured to this place. He thought indignantly that he should have guessed that there was a trick. Even the name sounded suspicious. At this moment, he remembered Ai Weiwei's question about the interview and her guess about the magical energy in the air. He squinted his eyes and peered into the distance, thinking out loud that Ai Weiwei was probably right. This call was as strange as the number it came from. In addition, the woman on the other end of the line was acting rather suspiciously. In the end, Hao Ren made a firm decision to leave this place immediately and ask Ai Weiwei what was going on. Just as he was about to leave, his phone rang again. Taking out his mobile from his pocket, Hao Ren saw that it was an unknown number calling again. Grinning in annoyance, he hung up without hesitation and continued walking forward. However, a second later his phone rang again, as if mocking him. Hao Ren smirked and pulled the battery out of the device, confident that this would end this nightmare. But as soon as he pulled the battery out, the phone, contrary to logic, started ringing again, as if it didn't need charging. In anger, he threw his mobile phone into the bushes and loudly declared that he would now see if the girl could call him again after he destroyed his device. The phone plunged into the ground, stuck there like a blade. However, a moment later, it rang again. The loud signal coming from underground made Hao Ren break out in a cold sweat. He cursed in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. Gathering his courage, he slowly pulled the phone out of the ground. He answered the call with a stern frown and demanded an explanation in an irritated tone. In response, the girl on the other end of the line screamed loudly, demanding to know why he had not yet shown up for the interview. She then repeated her question, clearly losing her patience. Hao Ren sighed heavily and sarcastically asked if they could stop this charade of a fake interview and just tell him what they really wanted from him. The girl, who introduced herself as Raven 12345, calmly replied that they had strict rules set by the management. At this time, she looked at the blue crystal that reflected Hao Ren's image and added that their secret would only be revealed at the appointed time and under certain conditions. With a sly smile, she informed Hao Ren that he should simply follow her instructions and he would be able to find them. Infuriated, he shouted sharply, telling her to shut up and demanding that she explain what they wanted first. At this point, Raven 12345 visibly tensed up, irritated by his resistance. Hao Ren continued. An innocent person would not lie and lure him into an interview under false pretenses. Raven 12345 lost her patience and screamed into the phone, telling him to move the phone away from his ear. Even the dog sitting next to Hao Ren shuddered in fear. She then continued to scream, dissatisfied with his stubbornness, and said that if she said it was an interview, then it was an interview. When Hao Ren pressed the phone to his ear again, her voice was slightly quieter, but still irritated. She demanded that he finally shut up and just follow her instructions. Grumbling under his breath, Hao Ren moved forward. Raven 12345 told him to find a telephone pole and put his hand on it. He winced, but complied. She then told him that if he saw an advertisement for Chinese medicine, he should turn north. To this, he sarcastically asked where she thought north was. In response, Raven 12345 stated without a shadow of a doubt that he shouldn't eat sour watermelon. Then, before he could even comprehend the absurdity of the situation, she told him to lift his head and look up. Hao Ren obediently raised his head and froze in amazement as he saw a huge castle surrounded by lush gardens in the sky. He continued to stare at the city floating in the air, unable to believe his eyes. Raven 12345 told him the first rule for all employees: no one can take any action without orders from their superiors. However, since Hao Ren was not yet a member of their ranks, this rule did not apply to him. Raven 12345 then told him to focus his gaze on the square, warning that otherwise she could not guarantee that he would reach his destination. At that moment, a powerful force lifted Hao Ren into the air. He screamed in panic as his feet left the ground, and then screamed even louder as he felt his body spinning in chaotic swirls of magical energy. As soon as he reached his destination, he was literally thrown to the floor. He recovered for a few seconds, then stood up and entered a corridor lined with numerous paintings. Soon, a man in a blue suit appeared in front of him, or rather, only his silhouette. Without wasting time, Hao Ren followed this mysterious guide, wondering why he seemed so incorporeal. He looked at the paintings carefully, but it seemed strange to him that they did not go together at all. Soon the silhouette stopped, and Hao Ren wondered if he had reached his destination. Then he noticed a cluster of blue energy near the door. Walking closer, he tapped his finger on the surface, and immediately heard a voice inviting him to enter. Touching the bright blue crystal, he was surprised to see how the door instantly dissolved into thin air, crumbling into countless sparkling particles. Entering the room, he looked around, amazed by its size. His gaze lingered on the shelves filled with magical artifacts, the significance of which he had no idea. However, what caught his attention most was a lonely pancake with an egg resting on the table. And the strangest thing was that it had no plate. Raven 12345 greeted him, pointed to an empty seat, and invited him to sit down. Meanwhile, he couldn't stop thinking about the ill-fated pancake. Nervously, Hao Ren slowly walked to the chair and sat down. Raven 12345 crossed her legs and held her hand out to the side, declaring that he could call her that. She then added that she was now his boss. Puzzled, he chuckled uncertainly, then asked what this place was. Raven 12345 folded her hands in front of her and stated that he was in the Space-Time Management Office. She then mentioned EN35 Station, a leading toy company. Hao Ren raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked if he had really heard correctly. In response, Raven 12345 only smirked slyly and repeated that this was the Space and Time Management Office, and the so-called foreign trade company was just a cover. He turned pale at the realization and asked in confusion, "But what about the second agency mentioned?" Raven 12345 smiled broadly and repeated the name, Top Toys Hip, carelessly. He chuckled nervously and wondered how these two completely different establishments could possibly be in the same place. A funny analogy came to his mind. It was like the Van family, where the eldest son was called Da Ming, the middle one was Man, and the third, as one might guess, was called Asili Ulim Hannibal. In the end, he came to the conclusion that standing before him was undoubtedly a real idiot. Chuckling, he extended his index finger in front of him and asked again if he had understood correctly that this was the Space-Time Management Office. Scratching the back of his head, he asked a new question. What exactly was the name of his boss? With a slight change in tone, Raven 12345 frowned and repeated that her name was exactly that, and he should remember that. Then, raising her index finger, she sternly stated that the numbers at the end of the name were an important part of distinguishing ravens. He listened to her explanation, nodded uncertainly, and then thought about it. This was all starting to sound like a Star Wars plot. He couldn't help but ask if they were talking about a war against clones to conquer the universe. Hao Ren chuckled and thought that it sounded very original, and then asked why Raven 12345 had chosen him. And in response, she extended her hand and asked him if he had anyone unusual at home. Then, with a sly smile, she clarified that she meant a werewolf. Hell. Hao Ren broke out in a cold sweat, pursing his lips, wondering if she really knew about it. However, he also realized that Raven 12345 seemed to know nothing about AI Weiwei yet. Looking at Raven 12345's smile, Hao Ren acknowledged that it was true and immediately asked if it was forbidden. He then asked if their organization was involved in such things. Raven 12345 spread her hands and said that even stranger creatures would appear in his house because it was part of his new job. Then, closing her eyes, she noticed that there were no strict prohibitions now, but she just wanted to remind him that the organization had high hopes for him. Hao Ren interrupted her abruptly and asked if this was really their plan. Raven 12345 chuckled and assured her that of course it wasn't, but that was exactly how it would be from now on. She also pointed out that he had already established contact with the werewolf Liu Lai. Raven 12345 then said that she needed help as well, and Hao Ren was perfect for the job. Hao Ren narrowed his eyes and asked what their organization actually did. Raven 12345 smiled and said that their structure was vast, and every planet in the galaxy was under their surveillance. Then, folding her arms, she stated that the Space and Time Management Department was the Holy Empire's instrument of control over all known universes. Raven 12345 took out a long scroll and feigned innocence, declaring that this was what was written in the documents she had received from her superiors. However, she added with a playful smile that she would make some adjustments later. Winking at Hao Ren, she explained that she was only holding a basic position, but for certain reasons she was obliged to work here. Then, she suddenly pointed her finger straight at Hao Ren, causing him to turn pale. Raven 12345 explained that since she had to manage the entire universe, she needed an assistant to handle the small tasks in individual areas. She then winked again and announced with a smile that Hao Ren had been chosen by the gods as an agent. She then asked if he felt proud of himself. Hao Ren, after hearing this, sarcastically thanked her and remarked that their special program sounded very tempting. However, he immediately asked, uncertainly, where the exit was. Raven 12345 immediately removed the smile from her face and said in a stern voice that according to the rules, new employees are required to undergo psychological testing, which takes a lot of time. At that moment, she snapped her fingers. Hao Ren suddenly felt himself being lifted into the air, and realizing that he was no longer standing, he let out a loud cry. The next moment, he found himself in outer space, floating among many planets, moons, and sparkling stars. First, he saw the Milky Way, and then, turning the other way, he noticed the Earth. His eyes widened in amazement, and his hand involuntarily stretched forward. Suddenly, he was back in Raven 12345's office, lying on a chair, drenched in cold sweat. He stared into space, rubbing his face with his hands, realizing that what he had just seen was neither an illusion nor human technology. Raven 12345 had easily explained that it was a recording of the creation of the universe. However, she also emphasized that she did not record it herself, but simply showed a period of time taken directly from the lower-level universe. Thus, Raven 12345 stated, Hao Ren could consider himself to have witnessed the very creation of the universe, After that, she asked if he would accept the job. In response, Hao Ren grimaced and asked why he was chosen. Raven 12,345 said with a slight smile that he was perfect for the job. Then she added that not everyone could calmly accept the existence of a werewolf under their roof. Coming close to him, she took his chin in her hand, grinned, and said that she needed a man with strong convictions, because only such people would cope with the upcoming upheavals. At that moment, Hao Ren immediately asked a direct question. What would happen if he refused? Raven 12,345 turned her back to him, and, without turning around, calmly stated that this was a completely voluntary job. However, if he did not agree, his memories of the past 2 days would be completely erased, and he would never encounter this world again. After a brief thought, he sighed and agreed. With a satisfied smile, Raven 12,345 handed him a stack of documents and informed him that he was now an entry-level examiner trainee. She then explained that he would have 2 main tasks. The first was to house the residents, each of whom would have special abilities. The second was to ensure that these residents did not pose a threat to human society. After she finished explaining, she asked how he was going to handle this. After listening to her, Hao Ren frowned and asked why he thought this was the most important part of the job. Raven 12,345 chuckled and told him to relax, explaining that if anyone tried to interfere with the natural evolution of humanity, they would have to deal with it. His job was simply to clean up the mess. Taking the documents, Hao Ren began to study the terms of payment and benefits for the staff. Among the items listed were annual bonuses in the form of food and household goods for the Chinese New Year, as well as monthly payments. However, one of the items stated that the final decision on bonuses depended on the cultural norms of the region. Suddenly, Raven 12,345 spread her hands and loudly told him not to dwell on such trivialities. Then she cheerfully suggested a toast to the new employee. In response, Hao Ren simply stood there silently, not knowing what to say. A short time later, he found himself back on Earth, standing by the same telephone pole. He chuckled as he watched the orange sunset and thought about how pointless his job as a god seemed. He glanced around and wondered if Raven 12,345 really couldn't fix the transit system. Then, with a sarcastic grin, he decided that at least in religious cultures, he should now be considered a prophet. Suddenly, the phone rang. Hao Ren answered the call and immediately heard Liu Lilai screaming loudly, panicking that Ao Weiwei had flown out the window and she had not been able to catch up with her. Hao Ren smiled thoughtfully, realizing that he had not yet had time to properly start his new job, and problems were already starting to pile up. Without wasting a second, he rushed through the city, trying to get home as quickly as possible. When he finally got home, he was met by Ai Weiwei, who had already prepared dinner, and a beaming Liu Lilai stood next to him, happily greeting the owner. Hao Ren silently looked at the 2 girls, while Gan the cat rubbed against his leg, welcoming his return. Liu Lilai smiled broadly and cheerfully told Hao Ren to quickly sit down at the table, since dinner was already ready. Obediently sitting down, he smiled slyly, wondering if these 2 knew about his new status. Then, folding his hands in front of him, he turned to Ai Weiwei and asked with a smile if she had accidentally transformed into a bat and flown away somewhere. Ai Weiwei chuckled and calmly replied that she thought there were some annoying guys who would even follow her home. Hao Ren then suddenly changed his tone and asked about other werewolves. Liu Lilai immediately pouted and said that Ai Weiwei was hanging out with them, but the ones she was referring to were not werewolves, but monster hunters. Hearing this, Hao Ren wondered if she was referring to Abraham Van Helsing. However, Ai Weiwei lowered her head and asked him not to joke, because she was talking about modern monster hunters, those who are only half human. She also explained that humans called them monster hunters, and people like her were considered strange creatures. According to her, this conflict had been going on for a long time, and neither side had ever achieved a final victory. Over time, the hunters began to cooperate with humans to protect humanity. After listening to her, Hao Ren thought that Crow 12,345 clearly wanted him to look after these strange creatures. Looking away, he came to the conclusion that monster hunters were, in fact, simply fighting to protect humans. Everything that was happening seemed like something he was already too deeply entangled in. Ai Weiwei calmly said that she had followed the trail but had found nothing suspicious. Hao Ren scratched his head and asked if it was a false alarm. Ai Weiwei then hugged Liu Lilai and assured Hao Ren that if there really was a hunter here, she would have left immediately and taken the stupid werewolf with her so as not to cause trouble for the young man. Then, With her hands clasped in a pleading gesture, she began to explain that she did not want to cause inconvenience and asked not to be thrown out. Ai Weiwei also promised that until she found a job, she would cook and clean the house. Hao Ren took a piece of food and noticed that Ai Weiwei seemed to be very nervous about the hunter. After chewing, he smiled widely and praised her cooking skills. He then assured Ai Weiwei that even if there really was a hunter in the city, she and Liu Lilai had nothing to worry about. The girl smiled warmly, but then asked where he got his confidence from. In response, Hao Ren took out a document from his pocket and proudly handed it to Ai Weiwei, who immediately began to read it. He wondered out loud why he should be afraid when Raven 12,345 was covering for him now. After reading the document, Ai Weiwei patted him on the shoulder and said that she knew how tense he had been lately. Hao Ren slapped his palm on the table and loudly declared that he was serious, as he had spent several hours figuring this out. He then asked if she realized how difficult it had been. Suddenly, Liu Lilai put her finger to her lips and asked if this meant that Hao Ren was now as great a figure as Jesus Christ or Mohammed. Hao Ren immediately pointed at her and sarcastically asked Ai Weiwei if she realized that even a werewolf had figured out the situation. Liu Lilai smiled widely and asked if this meant that they no longer had to pay rent. Hao Ren frowned and warned her not to even think about it. He smiled smugly, pointed his thumb at himself, and suggested to Ai Weiwei that if she didn't believe him, they should go to Raven 12,345 together, as it wouldn't break any rules. Ai Weiwei asked if that meant Raven had simply forced him to take them under her wing. Then, saying that she still had things to do, she wished Hao Ren a rest. In response, he smiled broadly, assured her that he could handle it himself, and suggested that she relax. After taking a bite of food, Ai Weiwei said that she needed to look into this space and time management office, because she had never heard of it before. When she stood up to clear the plates, Hao Ren noticed that the food tasted strange to him and realized that it was garlic. Raising an eyebrow, Ai Weiwei asked if it bothered him that much. In response, he asked if she really belonged to a different race. Later, Hao Ren lay on a lounge chair with his eyes closed, enjoying the warm evening. At that moment, he realized that he had a noble lady cooking for him and a werewolf looking after the house. It all seemed like a dream to him. Hearing Liu Lilai exclaim happily that the TV had a signal and was showing an advert for dog food, he wondered why she was so happy about it. Then Hao Ren slowly closed his eyes and finally fell asleep. However, he suddenly opened them sharply and turned pale with horror, seeing a completely different world in front of him. He chuckled nervously and began to wonder what was going on and if he was really home. He then suggested that perhaps the monster hunter's magic had worked on him. He frowned and cursed under his breath, wondering if he had been overtired lately. Ai Weiwei frowned, looking at Hao Ren with a puzzled expression, then tapped her finger on her chin thoughtfully and said that she might have done something wrong. Liu Lilai lazily propped her head up with her hand as she watched the failed attempts, and chuckled as she remarked that maybe Hao Ren was just too stubborn for magic. Ai Weiwei looked at Liu Lilai with annoyance, then turned to Hao Ren and said in a serious voice that her magic had never failed, and if the spell didn't work, then the problem was clearly within him. Hao Ren scratched the back of his head, wondering if he was such an ordinary person that even magic couldn't work on him. Liu Lilai giggled, tilting her head to the side, and remarked that it would be nice if he was completely resistant to magic, since then he wouldn't be able to be cursed. Hearing this, Ai Weiwei narrowed her eyes and said that she needed to check something. She suddenly took out a small bottle of liquid from her pocket and then carefully dripped a few drops onto Hao Ren's palm. At that very moment, the liquid evaporated, leaving behind only a faint metallic smell. Ai Weiwei's eyes widened and she exclaimed that this was impossible. Hao Ren looked at her worriedly and asked what happened. Ai Weiwei sighed heavily and looked at his palm, saying with some confusion that this liquid should have immediately reacted with any curse or magical effect. Liu Lilai leaned closer, sniffed the place where the liquid was, and incredulously declared that she felt absolutely nothing. Ai Weiwei turned her gaze to Liu Lilai and crossed her arms over her chest, asking suspiciously if she was sure that she couldn't sense even the slightest trace of magic. Liu Lilai shrugged, leaning back in her chair, and said that if there was something, she would have sensed it by now. Hao Ren frowned after hearing their conversation, and then hesitantly suggested that maybe he was simply not susceptible to magic, and that this was some kind of hidden characteristic of his. Ai Weiwei ran her finger across her chin thoughtfully, and admitted that while it was theoretically possible, it was extremely rare. Liu Lilai looked at Ai Weiwei curiously, and asked if this meant that Hao Ren was some kind of unique existence. Ai Weiwei nodded, but then added that it was too early to draw conclusions, since perhaps the reason was not in him, but in something else. Hao Ren tiredly covered his face with his hands and muttered that the further he went, the more questions he had. Ai Weiwei chuckled and said that now he would have to get used to a life full of mysteries. Ai Yiwei wondered if she was making a mistake, or if the reason was due to the environment. After that, she decided to use a different method. After a while, Liu Lailai continued to play with Gun, and Ai Yiwei took a deep breath and asked Hao Ren if he was sleepy and relaxed. Hao Ren replied that he felt fine, and guessed that Ai Yiwei's spell had not worked. Ai Yiwei pursed her lips and turned away. She created a circle of energy around herself and calmly addressed Liu Lailai, asking her to stay put. As soon as Ai Yiwei released her energy, Liu Lailai instantly fell into a deep sleep. Ai Yiwei immediately noticed that the werewolf lacked any defense. Hao Ren excitedly suggested that he was immune to magic, like the characters in web novels. Ai Yiwei sneered and said that only fools could be completely immune to magic. Indignant, Hao Ren demanded that she watch her words, reminding her that he still expected her to repay the debt. Ai Yiwei ignored his displeasure and easily turned the conversation into a joke, adding that she simply had a high sensitivity to magic, while Hao Ren was just an ordinary person. Suddenly, Ai Yiwei said that she had lost contact with her blood, and she felt that the connection Hao Ren had made was different from usual. She advised him to discuss this with Crow. Suddenly, Ai Yiwei screamed loudly, declaring that she had made an important discovery. With a smile on her face, Ai Yiwei advised him to use a protective amulet for now. She explained that this amulet could protect Hao Ren and free him from negative influences. Hearing this, Hao Ren froze in amazement, looking at Ai Yiwei with a dumbfounded expression.